The Chinese dissidents hold a variety of political opinion that often challenge the policy and the authority of the CCP. The first political opinion is advocacy for democratic reforms. So many dissidents, they call for democratic reforms, which include free elections, freedom of speech, and an independent judiciary. And they argue that democracy would lead to more accountable governance and greater personal freedoms. But the CCP, however, view these demands as threats to its one-party rule and often labels such advocacy as tools of foreign influence. So that Chinese government's response typically includes censorship, harassment, and imprisonment of these voicing such opinions. And the second political opinion is human rights activism. So dissidents often criticize the CCP for their human rights abuses, which include the treatment of ethnic minorities and suppression of religious freedom and the use of torture or arbitrary detention. So the human rights activists push for international standards for human rights and greater transparency. But the CCP defends its policies as necessary for social stability and national unity, which dismissing the international criticism as an interference to China's internal affairs. That is why the activists are often frequently subject to surveillance, legal repercussion, and smear campaign. And the third political opinion is support for autonomy or independence movement. For some dissidents, they are support movements while seeking a great autonomy or independence. For some regions like Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong, they argue for the rights of this region for self-determination and preservation of their cultural identity. But the CCP consider such movements a direct challenge to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The CCP uses a combination of propaganda and political indoctrination and forceful suppression to counter this movement and maintain control. And the fourth political opinion is anti-corruption campaigns. The corruption within the ranks of the CCP and the government institution is a common target of dissident criticism, but the dissidents argue that the corruption undermines justice and economic equality. Well, the CCP publicly promotes the anti-corruption initiatives, but it is selective in its enforcement and often using anti-corruption campaigns to sidelight the political rivals. So the dissidents who expose corruption risk retaliation, which including legal action and personal threats, which under the guise of disrupting public order or revealing the state secret. And another political opinion is cultural liberalization and reform. So some dissidents advocate for greater cultural openness and liberalization, which including freedom of express in arts and media, and the relaxation of censorship laws. They believe that cultural freedom is essential for creativity, innovation, and personal development. But CCP, however, maintains strict control over cultural production and media to ensure that they are aligned with socialist value and party's agenda. So this regime often censors content that are not conform with its ideology stance. So dissidents promoting for cultural reform can face accusation of spreading Western values or undermining Chinese culture, which leading to a blacklisting from the professional bands. And another political opinion is legal reform and rule of law. So the legal scholars and advocates among the dissidents, they push for comprehensive reform to establish a general rule of law, where the laws are transparently made and impartially enforced, and where the judges are independent of the political influence. They argue that without this change, legal right cannot be adequately protected. But the CCP also claimed the support rule of law, but it is defined within the framework of the party leadership and ensuring that legal interpretation align with the party directives. But so that's why the lawyers and advocates who challenge this system often face debarment and detention or even harsh legal penalties. And another political opinion is internet freedom and information flow. So advocates for internet freedom in China challenge the extensive censorship and surveillance practices of the Chinese government, which including the Great Firewall and the strict regulation on online speech. So these dissidents argue for unrestricted access for information as a fundamental human right, but the CCP, however, views the control of internet as essential to maintain the social order and national security, so efforts bypass the censorship often result in arrests, fines, and intensive monitoring. So as the Chinese government seeks to maintain in its narrative and suppress dissent. And another political opinion is labor rights and economic inequality. So labor activists and dissidents, they highlight the issues of workers' rights and fair wages or economic inequality, which exacerbated by China's rapid economic growth. They organize for better labor conditions and the right to form independent unions and equitable economic policies. But the CCP were occasionally responsive to these specific labor issues, but generally they suppress any independent labor movement and maintains control over all unions through the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which is a state-controlled entity. Like the activists pushing the independent labor rights, right, but they are facing harassment, job loss, and imprisonment, as the CCP fears that organized labor could challenge its authority. And another political opinion is gender equality and social justice. For advocates within China also focus on the gender equality and LGBTQ+ rights and broader social justice issues. They advocate for laws and social reforms that protect the rights of women and sexual minorities. They aim to address a deep-seated cultural and institutional biases. But the CCP's stance on these issues is mixed. Well, there have been some advanced for women's rights, but for the LGBTQ+ rights often remain in a sensitive area with the minimal official support. So that the advocates pushing for these rights will facing societal and sometimes the state-sanctioned discrimination with the activities monitored or restricted due to the fear of undermining the traditional social values. And another political opinion is reassessment of the party's history. So some intellectuals and historians, they call for a critical reassessment of the CCP's historical narratives, particularly concerning events like the Great Famine or the Cultural Revolution or the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest. They seek a more open and honest dialogue about the past as a way to foster reconciliation and learning. But the CCP, however, tightly controls its historical discourse to maintain a positive image of its leadership and policies, so that the historian and the intellectuals challenging these official narratives can face censorship, loss of employment, and the accusation of spreading the anti-CCP sentiments.